We're going live. We're on the air. Hey. All right.
Hello.
Yeah. And today we're going to be talking about Blood Meridian, Cormac McCarthy's magnum opus.
Yeah. And it's funny because when it came out in 85, from what I'm reading as I was reading up, getting ready for this talk, is it was no fanfare. Like, yeah, another Western book or whatever. I mean, how common they were in the 80s, but they don't seem too common, especially the films. If you look at Western films on Wikipedia, 80s is a dramatic drop off, which is really interesting. But in 85, he writes this, and it soon, in the course of the next 15, 20 years, became considered by many not only his greatest work, but one of the greatest novels ever written. Certainly of the genre, but just in general. It's a big switch.
Yeah. I read some, reviews of it from 1985, and people were just appalled by the violence and didn't know what to make of it other than that.
Yeah, I guess that's something we'll talk about, is the violence of Blood Meridian. And I think the title is at least somewhat of a fair warning of what's to come.
Like the subtitle, An Evening Redness in the West.
Exactly.
Redness, that's just understatement of the year,
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea of these kind of burgundy colored, tiles that are, caked with blood. Like there's a one scene I remember when the tiles is caked with blood. And then it's just an amazing image, and they call them burgundy tiles.
I actually have that queued up, so let's play it.
Oh, look at you and me.
Look at what the square. Sproul was gone. All about lay in shadow. He crossed the square and mounted the stone steps to the door of the church and entered. Sproul was standing in the vestibule. Long buttresses of light fell from the high windows on the western wall. There were no pews in the church, and the stone floor was heaped with the scalped and naked and partly eaten bodies of some 40 souls who barricaded themselves in this house of God against the heathen. The savages had hacked holes in the roof and shot them down from above, and the floor was littered with arrow shafts where they'd snapped them off to get the clothes from the bodies. The altars had been hauled down and the tabernacle looted, and the great sleeping god of the Mexicans routed from his golden cup. The primitive painted saints in their frames hung cocked on the walls, as if an earthquake had visited, and a dead Christ in a glass bier lay broken in the chancel floor. The murdered lay in a great pool of their communal blood. It had set up into a sort of pudding, crossed everywhere with the tracks of wolves or dogs, and along the edges it had dried and cracked into a burgundy ceramic. Blood lay in dark tongues on the floor, and blood grouted the flagstones, and it ran in the vestibule where the stones were cupped from the feet of the faithful and their fathers before them, and it had threaded its way down the steps and dripped from the stones among the dark red tracks of the scavengers. Sproul turned and looked at the kid as if he'd know his thoughts, but the kid just shook his head. Flies clambered over the peeled and wigless skulls of the dead, and flies walked on their shrunken eyeballs.
Yeah, that's a nice image there.
Yeah, that's a really, representative quote from the novel. And a couple of things, I mean, great choice, and it's interesting how we were thinking about the same image as we start to talk about this. And there's the blood caked from the savages, and that whole image of them shooting the arrows down with these people just captured. And it's an image that comes up again and again in the book, whether they're in the prison in Chihuahua, whether they're actually in the Presidio, and you have the judge walking around the perimeter, right, in the rain. And then we know what happens there, because the Presidio is a very interesting, similar scene. So this scene, you have the Comanche, who is this, we'll talk about that horde, that horrible, horrible horde. but the Comanche come in and they're basically like this death machine that come through the countryside. And what we're seeing in this scene is we're seeing basically the wake of their plunder. And it is absolutely ruthless and godless. And, you know, of course, it's happening in a church. It is horrifying. You know, it truly is.
Yeah, you know, we talk about the revisionist Western, you know, and how they like sort of turn the tables on that idea of, you know, like the good white man liberating this thing, you know, where we really, you know, again, slaughtered people just like in this situation here. But, you know, there's no good guys in this story, I don't think.
No. Yeah, slaughter comes on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting when we talk about revisionist history, and that's a kind of one of the other scenes that as I was reading the book for the second time, I read it 5 years ago. And then when you were doing Western 106, I was like, you know, that's the pinnacle of the kind of the ultimate in the Western genre taken to its logical, you know, conclusion. But what's interesting about this book, in my mind, two things. Supposedly, he had been researching it for over 10 years. And it's actually factually pretty accurate, right? He had gone through actual, Samuel Chamberlain, I think, was one of the actual works that he had based it on.
Yeah.
And he had based it on one of the foremost historians of Texas and parts of Mexico. So he did some real research. And so the theory is that a lot of this is based on, you know, this group of rangers turned rogue. But for me, one of the most telling moments in the early parts of the book is when the kid, who's only always referred to as the kid, is recruited by Captain White, who we later see his head in a jar, literally. But Captain White, having this unbelievable, almost judge-like speech, where he talks about manifest destiny, he talks about the exploits of, you know, the Americans in Mexico, because Sonora, before we know it, is going to be a part of California, and the annexation of the rest of Mexico is, you know, it's just a matter of time, and it's either the Americans doing it or the Europeans. And this is a very interesting historical kind of touchstone. Of course, we have the kind of term filibuster, which is about a band of illegitimate soldiers who go into another country and try and foment revolution, which then becomes a political term for illegitimate politicians trying to prevent real process. But what's crazy about it is this is right after the Mexican-American War. So this is 1849, 1850. Like, you can actually put it in a time and place. And during the Mexican-American War, the U.S. had annexed, you know, 2/3 of its landmass. California, Texas, parts of New Mexico, Arizona, Utah. I mean, a major part of what we now call the United States. And it's very interesting because this notion, I think, that I believe Cormac McCarthy does a beautiful job of, is framing what you're saying right there with the anti-Western or the revisionist Western as, like, this was an imperial war fought with tooth and blood to actually, you know, take what was someone else's, doing exactly which those European colonials that Captain White is talking against, the American people, or the American, I don't know if you could speak for everyone, but I think the government was definitely behind this to some degree, at least the Mexican-American War, are becoming the very thing that supposedly 60 years earlier they had revolted against. An imperial power that writes its power with blood. And I have to think at least one part of the violence and the extremity of violence is McCarthy dealing with that history we don't want to face.
Yeah, I was reading John Sullivan, who's the guy who, you know, came up with this phrase, manifest destiny. So here I have a quote from him.
America is destined for better deeds.
It is our unparalleled glory that we have no reminiscences of battlefields, but in defense of humanity, of the oppressed of all nations, of the rights of conscience, the rights of personal enfranchisement. Our annals describe no scenes of horrid carnage, where men were led on by hundreds of thousands to slay one another, dupes and victims to emperors, kings, nobles, demons in the human form called heroes. We have had patriots to defend our homes, our liberties, but no aspirants to crowns or thrones, nor have the American people ever suffered themselves to be led on by wicked ambition to depopulate the land, to spread desolation far and wide, that a human being might be placed on a seat of supremacy.
That's really telling because, right, that's very similar to Captain White's speech to the kid, you know, in the second or third chapter.
Yeah, and I'm reading, Sullivan's stuff. He wrote this article, Great Nation of Futurity, back in the 1840s, and this is like pushing the idea of manifest destiny. And so much of the language sounds like something that would come out of this book,
And that is absolutely, like, for me, one of those points where the way in which the book, and I think, Sandy Jensen Brown said this, and I think she's absolutely right. Like, the book, for me, is either you can think of it as like a wave in the ocean or even like a series of dunes in the desert, which might be better for this. Like, there's this lyrical movement to the book that makes you feel like it's some sort of like dream-like, nightmarish, like a rendering of someone like Franz Kafka and his novels, The Trial, The Castle, you name it. But then there's these moments where in that lyricalness, and you hear it read, whether it be of the church and the horror that's happened there, but how lyrical it sounds, but also this moment where Captain White has this really kind of practice and rehearsed speech about manifest destiny, the Monroe Doctrine, foreign powers. Are you going to let these savages or the Europeans, this foreign power, take over your space and your soul? And it's fascinating because, like, inside the lyricism, and there's so much of it, it's actually, you get lulled into it, is there's really, I think, these deep, critical, attempts to kind of really dispel and revise the whole notion of what we think of as this kind of expansive space that we kind of hopped into, and unfortunately there were some savages we had to tame, and we tamed them as we could without this kind of really kind of this more grand, incessant, and I don't want to say incestuous because it's not necessarily incestuous, but like just insane is maybe a better way to look at the kind of questions of violence and control and power and imperial kind of presence. He does a really good job of it, but in such a lyrical way, because it could be no time or it could be a time. Like, Glanton's group is a historical group in time and place, and Judge was mentioned in the narrative. I mean, he becomes this kind of larger than life mythical figure, and I think we should talk about the Judge. But there is this real history undergirding all this lyricism, which I think is such an interesting combination.
Yeah, but the historicism, it reminds me a lot of like Lovecraft, where he talks about things ancient and nameless, before mankind. Well, here's another quote somewhere. Okay, this is, they meet this guy, the Mennonite. I think it was in a bar, but let's see what he has to say.
They arrive at last before a wooden door. It's hinged into a larger door, or gate, and all must step over the foot-high sill where 1,000 boots have scuffed away the wood, where fools in their hundreds have tripped or fallen or tottered drunkenly into the street. The Mennonite watches the enshadowed dark before them as it is reflected to him in the mirror over the bar. He turns to them. His eyes are wet. He speaks slowly. The wrath of God lies sleeping. It was hid 1,000,000 years before men were, and only men have power to wake it. Hell ain't half full. Hear me. Ye carry war of a madman's making into a foreign land. You'll wake more than the dogs. But they berated the old man and swore at him until he moved off down the bar, muttering. And how else could it be? How these things end? In confusion and curses and blood. They drank on, and the wind blew in the streets, and the stars that had been overhead lay low in the west. And these young men fell afoul of others, and words were said that could not be put right again. And in the dawn, the kid and the second corporal knelt over the boy from Missouri who had been named Earl, and they spoke his name, but he never spoke back. He lay on his side in the dust of the courtyard. The men were gone. The whores were gone. An old man swept the clay floor within the cantina. The boy lay with his skull broken in a pool of blood, none knew by whom. A third one came to be with them in the courtyard. It was the Mennonite. A warm wind was blowing, and the east held a gray light. The fowls, roosting among the grapevines, had begun to stir and call. There is no such joy in the tavern as upon the road thereto, said the Mennonite.
Yeah, so you get that sense of the ancient and like the description of the entrance to the place, and then the wrath of God lies sleeping, millions of years. There's this reference, and it's just like a bar fight, but it sounds like something out of scripture, it's like tied in reference to the wind and the stars, and I don't know how to describe that, but there's so much in there.
It is. I mean, and it's elusive at the same time. But the beauty of that scene to me, and one of the reasons that's a scene that I tapped as well. And I tapped it because, you have this Mennonite figure exactly like this, almost biblical figure coming out to warn them against, the dogs of war and, where this will all end and you're waking a sleeping God. But then the actual action where this kid Earl is killed by someone else, who knows who, they even say that. This whole fight and this violence that is just kind of lyrically described in these very abstract, it's almost like Jackson Pollock, right? Like this abstract art moment where everything is abstracted out. And it's just as if it were a paragraph in the Bible describing some kind of really amazing moment in as kind of parsimonious and minimalist language as possible. And the effect, because we know that he can describe violence in detail. We've seen it already in this talk. We've heard it. But this is a really powerful moment. And then this kind of final proverb, right? Like the biblical stuff is right on this proverb of like, you'll never have so much anticipation or so much incitement or joy as you do on the way to the bar, as opposed to when you die in a bar fight. It's just, yeah, you're right. I mean, it's absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah, the whole thing, like the wrath of God lies sleeping. Again, why that makes me think of like Lovecraft is he's got that statement about the great Cthulhu lies sleeping in Relia,
Let's even, I mean, I really like where you're going with this, and let's take it back to the first page, right? I'm one of those stupid people who are a stickler for like first and last pages. Like, what do they mean? Like, you have to think like, this is this point. And this is funny, a little bit of a side before I go to the first page. So when I was reading this book 5 years ago, I was actually working on, I was just making the Shenandoah Literary Journal an online journal. So I was working with the editor down there. His name's Rod Smith. He's a great guy. And I happened to be reading this, and we were talking about books and whatever. And I was like, I'm reading this crazy book called Blood Meridian. And he kind of laughed, and he was like, yeah, it's a crazy book, one of the best. And he was like, I just wonder, because he was a writer, he's like, I wonder what Cormac McCarthy, where he had to go in his mind and in his imagination to write that book, and what kind of dark place he had to inhabit for years of his life to come up with that monster of a vision, which it is. I mean, and I found it was funny because I'm not a writer, so I don't come to it from that point of view. But to hear the point of view of another writer saying, what Frankenstein vision, what would you need to do to come up with this monster mentally? Like, at what point were you the madman you were creating? And I just love that idea. So anyway, that's an aside. But the first page, there is a line. It's a gorgeous, just a beautiful line, but it's also a line that captures what you said, this kind of timeless, all humanity in one line about this kid. And this is the description of the kid and his upbringing. We find again, it's like an abstract biblical upbringing. We find a little bits and pieces before he goes on his way to end up in Mexico fighting Apaches and Comanches. But this paragraph is fascinating, and even I'll put it to a line. All history present in that visage, the child, the father of the man. And so this is talking about the kid as he's getting ready to kind of like the fact that the violence that was within him was already present. And this idea that within the visage, you could already see the child, the father of the man. This notion that the child gives birth to the father. And that's like, this notion that the child is what leads this. Like, it's not you're once an innocent child and then you become this, jaded, violent man. Forgive me for that. But the other thing is that you actually have this notion of, like in The Wild Bunch, for example, to talk about another Western, where the kids themselves are violent. The kids themselves are disturbed. Like, violence is not something that's out there to be fought or to be kind of barriered from. It's something that encompasses us entirely. It's something within which we exist, right? And I think that there's a couple of interesting kind of epigraphs. And epigraphs is what becomes before. Am I right with that?
Yeah.
Okay, so those 3 epigraphs. The third one, where they talk about evidence of a scalping 300,000 years ago, is just such a telling notion of the timelessness that this story is trying to get at, while at the same time, as we said earlier, being very historically grounded.
Yeah. I mean, that timelessness, it's interesting. One is that like Lovecraftian thing, timeless, nameless, ancient. And then there's like reading this now, after recent wars and things that got us into that, there's things that the judge talks about where it's like a Nietzschean idea where, of man and Superman, how you impose, your will on the world. And then there's that quote from, Karl Rove, like about the reality-based community. And that's not the way the world works anymore. We're an empire now. When we act, we create our own reality. And while we're studying that reality out there, we're going to act again and make something new, like an idea that the truth doesn't even matter. It's like truth is what we say it is, And I see that coming out of the judge.
It raises real questions, I think, about just like, where does this book, like, if this book is about the questions of the regeneration through violence, right? And this notion of, because that's what a lot of people talk about. They talk about this vision of regeneration through violence in this book. And I just I'm kind of looking as I read it, and it's now the second time, like, where is there any sign of regeneration? Where is there any sign of this sense that, like, the blood will give way, to something that's anything other than more of it? It's just hard for me to find it. It's hard for me to find any kind of moral compass, or, I mean, the judge does stand as this larger life figure, and this philosophical figure, and he's pulling from the classics. He speaks Dutch somehow, right? Like he's like everything. Like he can make on a moment's call, he can make gunpowder, right, and take down a whole Apache army. Like he is this, truly this Superman, this Uberman. But at the same time, even that within there, right? Like there doesn't seem to be any compass for anyone to hold on to, right? And the way in which the book ends almost reaffirms that to the nth degree.
Well, I actually have the ending right here. So.
As the music soared up, there was a lively cry from all, and a caller stood at the front and called out the dance, and the dancers stomped and hooted and lurched against one another. And they are dancing. The board floors slamming under the jackboots, and the fiddlers grinning hideously over their canted pieces. Towering over them all is the judge, and he is naked, dancing, his small feet lively and quick, and now in double time, and bowing to the ladies, huge and pale and hairless, like an enormous infant. He never sleeps, he says. He says he'll never die. He bows to the fiddlers and sashays backwards and throws back his head and laughs deep in his throat. And he is a great favorite, the judge. He wafts his hat, and the lunar dome of his skull passes palely under the lamps, and he swings about and takes possession of one of the fiddles, and he pirouettes and makes a pass, 2 passes, dancing and fiddling at once. His feet are light and nimble. He never sleeps. He says that he will never die. He dances in light and in shadow, and he is a great favorite. He never sleeps, the judge. He is dancing, dancing. He says that he will never die.
So it's not really regeneration, is perpetuity, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, and does this mean like everything the judge represents, you know, which is this, is not going away, right? Like there is this, I mean, there is a sense of like, it's commented on again and again. There's nothing new. I mean, the violence in this book is horrific. The violence in this book is, and you know, I'm a TV baby from the 80s and 90s, right? I should be pretty inured to violence. Reading this book 5 years ago, I was like, what the hell? If you got a baby full of infants hung by their neck with a hole, like a tree with dead infants on it, is an image that's hard to get out of your head. I don't care who you are. And the way in which he draws it is insane. And so like you have this figure of the judge who at the end is endlessly dancing. And I've heard and I've read people talk about this scene, you know, something like he's a satyr, right? Something out of like Hieronymus Bosch. And you can say a lot of the book is something out of Hieronymus Bosch, right? I mean, it's just, it's hellish to some great degree. But there's also this sense of his timelessness. And there's that sense, and we've talked about it on the first page, we'll talk about it again now in the last paragraph, like there's this sense of what our relationship is to violence over time. And why I'm interested in that, and why I think you and I probably are interested in this book, is we've taught class again and again, whether it be on hard-boiled fiction, whether it be on noir, where violence is a very kind of integral part to the narrative and to the development of characters and to our sense of, right, the moral world we live in. And what I can't get out of my head is we've had students read Steven Pinker's, right, basically argument that, in fact, the world is becoming less and less violent and we're more and more safe. And you know, it's kind of like a leading us like best of all possible worlds as time goes by. Like we could live through times where this happened. And even in the 1850s, you would argue that, man, the 1850s was great compared to 600 years earlier or 2,000 years earlier. So there's this also sense of this kind of timeless monstrous notion of violence that runs through humanity and runs through the world and is part of everything that we are. And it's to judge it is to be the judge, right?
Mm-hmm.
But judge of what? It's one of my favorite lines.
Yeah.
He's a judge? A judge of what?
Judge.
I just love it. But like, I have a hard time. Like, I wonder if our fascination with violence and this vision of violence, if there's any truth to Pinker's notion that that comes out of our further and further distance from it, right? Like, can you imagine living through any of this, assuming that this is actually in some ways trying to be at least a facsimile of a historical narrative written by Samuel Chamberlain? Like, it's interesting to think that someone might have had some kind of experience along these lines.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I was reading something the other day about shell shock, you know, that someone whose father was like a World War I vet, and, you know, whenever it rained and there was thunder and lightning, he like brought the entire family into the basement and they would hide there because he's got memories of bombing, you know. So, you know, people have lived through scenes of horrific violence. It's not something I've had to experience, so I can't imagine it, but I guess there's people that can.
Yeah. Well, also the idea that, you know, even in our own moment, you bring up Karl Rove, makes me think of Bush and that whole moment. Like, you know, The American Sniper as an example of a movie that tries to highlight, you know, a particular scene I'm thinking of is when the Iraqi, or I think it's a Syrian sniper, holds a drill to a kid's head with the idea that, you know, if the father doesn't negotiate, right, this is going to be the end. And like, there's that really difficult moment to watch on film, you know, liking when I couldn't help but think of, if you were going to write a story about our moment, where would it be set? Like Blood Meridian, where would it be set? Would it be set in Afghanistan? Would it be set in Syria right now? Would it be set in Iraq 5 or 10 years ago? Like, I don't think that this notion of imperialism we talked about with Captain White and what's happening with Mexico and this imagination of a people as savages as a way that they need to be ruled because they're degenerate, like, we haven't completely gotten outside of that mindset by any means. In fact, you know, a lot of those prejudices are deeply still within us. Although I wonder if my own notions of violence and, you know, this displacement from it has everything to do with where I live and how I grew up and my sense of privilege from that point of view. But like, put your shoe on another foot. You're a kid in Afghanistan, right? You're a kid in Syria right now. Like, what a different story that would be along these lines with very similar broad narrative impulses for why that violence and why that horror is happening, right? Like, you can take some of what you imagine filibusterers like Captain White, and you can reimagine them pretty easily in places like Afghanistan or Syria, or even still in Mexico. Like, I mean, or even still in the US, right? It's not that hard.
Yeah. And they start out like fighting for their country, I guess, and then he falls in with the Glanton gang where they're fighting for profit originally against the savage, and then they realize they can just scalp anyone and cash those in, so they'll slaughter people indiscriminately, you know.
Yeah. And that's when you get to the scene at the river where, I mean, you've just basically, it's like you're at, you know, it's like you're at the river Hades. It's right. It's like you're on the way to hell. And that is a historical moment, right? Where this group took over the river bridge and the ferry so that anyone who's coming, they could rob and kill for any gold or silver or any other precious metal or valuable they had. And they were in competition with a Native American group down the river who was doing a similar thing, and the two ultimately got into it. I don't know if it was Apaches, but I think they said it was. And they basically got killed. You know, the Glanton gang was ultimately extinguished by a rival Native American group doing the same thing. I mean, and the way in which it's framed here, it's like, it's hard to see. Like, it's hard to take. It's not a narrative for me with any clear perspective of, like, you know, here's what really happened historically. Like, you know, here's what the good guys, the bad guys. It's just, it's a bloodbath.
Mm-hmm.
Literally.
Yeah.
You know, did you see the recent movie Revenant?
No, I haven't seen that yet.
Interesting. I couldn't help but think we should look at this scene, because I think it's one of the scenes we'll go back to, the horrible horde scene. I want to read a little bit from that. I don't know. Do you have the clip from the horrible horde? Oh, okay, we'll go to that. But the opening to The Revenant, and I don't know if The Revenant was a good movie. In fact, I think in some ways it wasn't a good movie. But it had some insane scenes. You'll hear one about the bear attack, which is an insane scene. But another one is a scene where a group of Pelters and Native Americans get into it right away, and they get into battle. And it's part of, like, some of the battles that you see and you read about in this book. I do think that there's a similar level of violence and of horror happening. I don't think to the degree of Blood Meridian, but you feel it.
So here's a Legion of Horribles.
The lattermost of the drovers were now coming through the dust, and the captain was gesturing and shouting. The ponies had begun to veer off from the herd, and the drovers were beating their way toward this armed company met with on the plain. Already you could see through the dust on the ponies' hides the painted chevrons, and the hands and rising suns and birds and fish of every device, like the shade of old work through sizing on a canvas. And now, too, you could hear above the pounding of the unshod hooves the piping of the quena, flutes made from human bones. And some among the company had begun to saw back on their mounts, and some to mill in confusion. Side of those ponies there rose a fabled horde of mounted lancers and archers, bearing shields bedight with bits of broken mirror glass that cast 1,000 unpieced suns against the eyes of their enemies. A legion of horribles, hundreds in number, half naked or clad in costumes Attic or biblical, or wardrobed out of a fevered dream, with the skins of animals and silk finery, and pieces of uniforms still tracked with the blood of prior owners, coats of slain dragoons, frogged and braided cavalry jackets, one in a stovepipe hat, and one with an umbrella, and one in white stockings and a blood-stained wedding veil, and some in headgear of crane feathers or rawhide helmets that bore the horns of bull or buffalo, and one in a pigeon-tailed coat worn backwards and otherwise naked, and one in the armor of a Spanish conquistador, the breastplate and pauldrons deeply dented with old blows of mace or saber done in another country by men whose very bones were dust, and many with their braids spliced up with the hair of other beasts until they trailed upon the ground, and their horses' ears and tails worked with bits of brightly colored cloth, and one whose horse's whole head was painted crimson red, and all the horsemen's faces gaudy and grotesque with daubings like a company of mounted clowns, death hilarious, all howling in a barbarous tongue and riding down upon them like a horde from a hell more horrible yet than the brimstone land of Christian reckoning, screeching and yammering and clothed in smoke like those vaporous beings in regions beyond right knowing, where the eye wanders and the lip jerks and drools.
Maybe the best passage in the book. I mean, the whole just wedding veil, bloodstained wedding veil, like, you know, conquistador armor, and just, you can see it almost like, you know, what's that 1950s, the not the rat, is it the rat? Like, you know, those kind of grotesque works of the custom car culture. And one of them has that, it's that famous rat. I'm forgetting the name, but it's this grotesque art. And like, I can't think of a more, you know, textbook example of the grotesque as this scene of Comanches coming at these soldiers who will soon just be absolutely decimated by them. I mean, this is amazingly gorgeous writing. Oh, it's beautiful.
Yeah. Beautiful and horrifying, you know. And that's the thing that struck me about this book is, you know, it's like when we looked at The Wire, you know, you look at it the first time and you focus on the plot because there's so much there. And then you look at it again and you look at the way the story is told, you know, and
Hey, Paul.
oh, there you go. Okay.
How you doing? I don't know what happened.
It says my network is experiencing difficulties.
Well, but go on. You were on it. Like the way in which the book kind of marries this notion of both the horrific and the beautiful at once.
Yeah. Yeah. In the way it's in the way the story is told. You know, like I was saying, thinking back to The Wire, we looked at, when you first look at it, you look at the details of the story because there's so much there. But when you look at it a second or a third time, you're looking at the way the story is told and how much more there is there. And, you know, in this case, you know, the details of the story are one thing, but in the way it's told is really telling you so much more, you know, all the illusions, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and the other thing too, for me, along those lines is, you know, you have this kind of your attempt to try and situate the story in a time and place, right? And, you know, find a kind of narrator who you can associate with. And it's very hard to associate with the kid, right? Anyone who he's attached to, like with Captain White, he's no kin to me. Like there is no attachment. Like he spits. He's like, you know, the guy who's going with, and his arm is basically falling off. And he's like, you know, do you want me to, you know, come with me? And he's like, no. He's like, well, okay. Like there's no attachment. Like there's no compassion. Like you look for a character in this book who you're going to try and associate with. The kid is who you're seeing it all through, but there's no association. But what I found myself attached to was the description. I found myself attached to the way in which he wrote the countryside, the way in which he spent so much time talking about the sky and the sun and the colors and how those colors and somehow the human tragedy, the human experience and the actual environment around it started to kind of meld in some ways, right? And the humans were just another thing on this canvas that he was writing. And their tragedy was of particular import to us because we could associate, but I didn't feel like it was any more valued than the color of the sun, right? And talk about some of those descriptions. I mean, here's one that it was almost like from The Road. You can see some of this in The Road, but this is one of my favorite descriptions I've ever heard of the sun. And there are so many in this book. And I want to get the exact quote because I think it's, if I try and paraphrase it, I won't do it justice. But there's this moment where he sees Hopefully I can find it. Give me a second. I did definitely comment it. So just give me 1 second.
Yeah.
And I promise it will be worth the waiting because it is just, for me, yeah, here it is. All night the wind blew, and the fine dust set their teeth on edge. Sand in everything, grit in all they ate. In the morning, a urine-colored sun rose blearily through panes of dust on a dim world and without feature. The animals were failing. A urine-colored sun rose blearily through panes of dust on a dim world and without feature. I mean, the insanity of the whole book aside, there are so many brilliant sentences that capture this landscape. And this one is particularly loaded because obviously it's a dim and doomed world, and that's Europe, but it's like the sun in the beginning of the road, right? The sun is described like a huge cataract. And here you have the sun urine colored and bleary, which is a lot similar to many of the characters. For example, there's the two Joes? Who that? There's the black and the white character, both who have the same name, right?
Yeah.
And I don't know why I'm forgetting their name, but they share the same name, and they're at each other. And at some point, stuff's going to go down between them. And it does eventually. And he describes the white man as basically similar, hungover, bleary, talking smack to the black guy, saying, look, you can't stay here. You go over with the rest of them, right? This is for us. This is for the white people. And then the black guy leaves. He's like, are you sure? This is how you feel? Yep. And he comes back behind him out of the shadows and cuts his head clean off. And it's just, what? Like, it's another scene. Like many, it's very hard to get out. And the guy's sitting there after this has all happened. The description stays on. His stops bleeding, kind of that settles down. He's still got his cigarillo in his fingers, and he's there the whole time. As they're all getting ready, they sleep, they go to bed, they get up the next day, and they leave, and he's still there, as he was, sitting, cross-legged, with a cigarillo in his hand. And there's that sense of just, what do you do with that? I don't know what even to do with it. It just is striking.
It's interesting the way so many of these scenes like foreshadow and reflect upon each other, because there's a scene later where the kid comes across some slaughter and finds an old woman sitting there cross-legged and talks to her and wants to get her help or whatever, and then realizes that she's actually dead and basically mummified and had been there forever.
Yeah. And there's other scenes. I mean, there has been theories around what happens between the judge and the kid at the end of the book. And that's not entirely clear. But there's also, I think there's a moment earlier in the book when they're in the Presidio. So, Glanton's gang just kind of coming off of the plains. They find this Presidio, and there's these 4 speculators who are holed up there. And then in this, and this is one of those scenes I can't get out of my head, there's this snake-bit horse or mule who's basically another just physical aberration. His eyes are popping out of his head. He's all swollen. The other horses want nothing to do with him. You can see his bone in certain areas. I mean, it's just a description to make you look away. And at the same time you have that, you also have somewhere in this weird Presidio-like courtyard a kid who's just freaked out, a kid, and who's scared. And he's described briefly. You come back the next morning, people getting up, getting ready. The mule's dead, right? It rained, the judge that's when he was walking around the perimeter in this weird way. The mule's dead, right? I think people are relieved. Then you find out the kid's dead, right? Naked and dead. And then you find out later his neck was broke. but like almost similar to the moment in the bar when we see the Mennonite. When what happens is completely unclear, in some ways even more powerful because of that. There are all these moments where some of the most horrific elements, kind of like the Jaws idea, right? You don't see what you don't see is even more horrific. What he doesn't tell you and what he doesn't fill in for you is even more horrific. I am haunted by that scene with the kid. I am haunted by that whole scene with the Presidio. 5 years later, that's the scene I remember. And it's not the most violent. It's not nearly as beautiful as The Horrible Horde. But there's something about it that's just completely unsettling. And there's no morality to it. Like, there's no author coming in and trying to make it all right, or talking to you and saying, like, this horrific deed done by this savage that, no, nothing. Absolutely nothing. And I think that's why the book, in the end, is so hard. I think there's only one other book I've read that was nearly as nihilistic. And I do think it's a certain amount of nihilism. And that was Dirty Snow. And that was a French book written during World War II by the guy who wrote all the Maigret stories. Simenon, yeah. Mm-hmm. And that is the darkest book I've ever read. It might even be darker than this. And it's not nearly as violent, but it might be darker. Like, this has got to be, and I don't know what this says about me, why I like it so much, but this has got to be one of the darkest books ever written.
Yeah.
It's insane. Like, Rod is right. Rod Smith was right. What was he, where did he come up with, like, where did he go to come back with this? It's almost like the two Delaware Indians. Like, where do they go? And then they come back with this stuff, right? Like, they come back just with the horse. So, like, I feel like McCarthy is one of those Delaware Indians going out into the deepest, darkest elements of our psyche and just coming back with this.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah, the thing, because he gives you such detailed descriptions and, like, gruesome detail in some cases, and then in others it's just, and then this happened, and what else could,
Exactly. And what else could, I really like that whole scene, the fatality of when the Mennonite's talking and he's like, as confusion in this runs, because what else, how else could it end? And there's just this whole, like, wisping over it, just like with this kid in this Presidio. And it's weird. It's like, I do think a lot of, I mean, Peckinpah not operating on the same scale in some ways in terms of, like, children. He sees children, I think, as just, these are just little evil beings. But almost McCarthy goes beyond that. Like, children, they're not spared anything. They're not, you don't really, like, they're part of the carnage. Like, there's no special place for children or animals, which in our culture we're used to, particularly animals.
So is this the one? Let's play this quote here.
None spoke. The judge sat half naked and sweating, for all the night was cool. At length, the ex-priest Tobin looked up. "It strikes me," he said, "that either son is equal in the way of disadvantage. So, what is the way of raising a child?" "At a young age," said the judge, "they should be put in a pit with wild dogs. They should be set to puzzle out from their proper clues the one of 3 doors that does not harbor wild lions. They should be made to run naked in the desert until—" "Hold now," said Tobin. "The question was put in all earnestness." "And the answer," said the judge. "If God meant to interfere in the degeneracy of mankind, would he not have done so by now? Wolves cull themselves, man. What other creature could? And is the race of man not more predacious yet? The way of the world is to bloom and to flower and die. But in the affairs of men there is no waning, and the noon of his expression signals the onset of night. His spirit is exhausted at the peak of its achievement. His meridian is at once his darkening. and the evening of his day. He loves games. Let him play for stakes. This you see here, these ruins wondered at by tribes of savages. Do you not think that this will be again? Aye, and again, with other people, with other sons. The judge looked about him. He was sat before the fire naked, save for his breeches, and his hands rested palm down upon his knees. His eyes were empty slots. None among the company harbored any notion as to what this attitude implied. Yet so like an icon was he in his sitting that they grew cautious and spoke with circumspection among themselves, as if they would not waken something that had better been left sleeping.
And there's so many things in there, like this image of the judge as a Buddha, and then something sleeping that you don't want to waken, like, the Cthulhu. And then that one line in the middle, if God meant to meddle in the degeneracy of man, would he have not have done so by now?
Yeah.
It's all talking about how to raise up kids.
And the idea of putting them in the pit with wild dogs, I mean, there's an image for you, right? Like, the thing of the judge, when I first heard about this book, the first time I heard about this book, I've heard about it. I knew about Carmen McCarthy, but the first time I got an insight to what it might be like was Brian Alexander on his InfoCult blog would write a lot about literature. And one of the things that he was writing about, who are the 10 most or whatever crazy villains or crazy figures in a novel. And I think he had the judge as number one. And I was like, who is this judge? Like, some of the others I recognize, but I was like, the judge, what is this character? And then once I started reading the book, you really do start to realize, just like you're saying, like, the judge is this, he's this complete, I don't know what to say. Like, is he Satan? Like, at the end of the book, you tend to think, like, is this Satan come to life? The eternal being, right? But at another point, he's actually human. And he'll speak with you, and he'll do things, and he'll save the group from, by making, very practical material things. But, like, the judge is an unbelievable character that straddles this notion of reality and complete mythos.
Mm-hmm.
I don't really know how to explain them, like much of the book, in fact.
Yeah, but in all those little passages, there's just so many things that you can latch onto.
The first you get of the judge. Okay, let's think about the first time we meet the judge, right? We meet the judge in a revival tent with a packed house, and this, I think it was Reverend Green, I think it was his name, but I'm not sure, is, preaching his word, and the judge interrupts and goes up, and he says, like, basically, I have evidence that this man has, sexually assaulted a young girl and a young boy, and, like, he goes with this list of yeah, right. And now goats, exactly. And the tent actually devolves into bedlam, people shooting each other, trying to escape. And, the kid, who we see this through the eyes of, is walking back to the cantina or the bar, what have you. And the judge is there before them. And this is that, which is weird in and of itself. And then, people start coming in, and they're like, hey, good for you. Hey, how'd you know him? How'd you know all this stuff about him? He's like, I've never seen him before in my life. Like, well, how did you have? And they were laughing because they didn't know how to take it. They're like, well, yeah, sure you did. Like, what happened? Like, what did you see? How did you know he did this stuff? He's like, I didn't know anything. That's it. And they all, like, don't know what to do. So they laugh, and then they go on. And that's your first vision of the judge. Mm-hmm. Seating complete. He's like the Joker, right? Like, just planting insane destruction to watch things burn.
It's so funny that you say that, because that's a line from Batman that I pulled out as well. Set the world afire to watch it burn. Um, yeah, I mean, he like shows up, he passes judgment that has no basis in anything other than his word. Like he's imposing his will onto the world, basically.
And it works.
Yeah,
I couldn't help but think, I mean, there was a couple of scenes, but I couldn't help but think, how is this book relevant? Like when you see the judge and you see some of their theories about power and people and the relationship and the fact that people, like, you can't help but, at least for me, see it through the lens of the political fiasco that's happening in America right now, right?
mm-hmm.
Where you have what seemingly is a megalomaniac, who's taking power. Look, we've had many of them before. I don't think that's new to Trump, but it seems like we have no perspective on it. It seems like that idea of the will to power is what's going to actually define, many things and destabilize many things. You know what I mean? So it's just, I couldn't help when reading some of this to feel that it was very contemporary for me as I watched from abroad too. Like watching America from abroad is interesting because it just looks like it's it's a powder room ready to blow. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And the idea of violence. I mean, let's not even like just think about it. Like not only the mass shootings, right? Like one a day last year, pretty much. But then like you have your own government, asking a major corporation to backdoor its people. I mean, like, it's a weird, and I'm sure that's all we see, and that's not all the country is, and I grew up there and I know that. But like from abroad, you get this weird vision of America that's not that different from what I'm reading in Blood Meridian. It just seems like, oh, it's just updated with automatic weapons.
Yeah. And that's an interesting thing when you look at Westerns, because especially like the iconic Westerns, what we look as iconic now are like, I guess, the spaghetti Westerns, which are, an Italian view of the U.S.
Yeah.
So like this is the lens that the rest of the world perceives us through. They see us as cowboys, And the other thing about the spaghetti Westerns is interesting because those are revisionist, right? There's this whole tradition of the Western that came before where it's, good guys, it's bad guys, cowboys and Indians, some kind of morality play, right always triumphs in the end. And then you get to things like High Plains Drifter where, it's bad guys and worse guys, basically.
Yeah.
And
then
that's what we perceive as the Western now.
And I think you do get to the logical extension of something like Blood Meridian, where there's even no sense of sides. And as I was reading it, as I was reading it this time, I know people have talked about, James Franco in particular has talked about filming it, and I think he filmed a 30-minute version piece of it. I haven't watched. But the idea of filming this movie, and I think Cormac McCarthy came out himself, he said, people saying, this is an unfilmable book. And he said, well, no, it's not unfilmable. You would just need to have the right brilliant mind to capture it. And reading the book this time, and because I love film, I was thinking like, it would be very interesting to me to see a John Ford take on Blood Meridian. Because, John Ford did his own revisions of history. I mean, the man who shot Liberty Valance is John Ford looking back over a genre he essentially framed and created for film, looking back on it and asking some serious questions about the genre. I mean, give John Ford another 50 years, which would be impossible. It'd be very interesting for me. I think he would be the person to do it, to come and look at, Blood Meridian through the lens of the history as a genre. We could say starts essentially with Stagecoach in 38. It would be really, really crazy because I think this is the end of the Western, right? Like this is where it stops in a sense. Like, I don't know how you move beyond it.
yeah, like the story Liberty Valance tells you is the history you know, the story you know is actually a lie. You know, but it also implies that it's for the best to be that way.
Exactly.
And,
Yeah, it needed to be.
yeah, and and what does that say about truth and morality?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
And it's interesting because, like, the one thing you never feel with Blood Meridian, as you talk about truth and lies, for example, is you never get the feeling that there's a lie anywhere, right? Like, it couldn't be, and this is not true per se. I mean, I'm caught in the binary I've created, but like there's no sense that someone's dissembling because it's all there. The author is laying out this canvas of reality for you, and what you have on it is basically, like you said, the battle by the will to power. It's just through violence that right gets defined.
mm,
Very barbaric in that way.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so do I have that quote here?
While you're doing that, Rat Fink was the person I was thinking, or the artist I was thinking about. The art, that rat, that grotesque
Okay,
rat,
yeah.
that's part of the custom car culture. That's what I was thinking.
Uh, okay, so I have the quote here where the judge goes on about war, but it's actually 7 minutes long, so I'm not going to do that because that's too much. But he brings up that image of, war endures, war is God, war is all there is. Um,
Well,
it made me think
here,
of Gordon Gekko, like greed is good, greed clarifies and purifies, and it's the same idea.
yeah, exactly. Here's a beautiful. Okay, let me grab this. So I've been looking. One of the things I like is, as I was reading Blood Meridian, I went around and looked for some art, right? And there's some pretty cool art of people doing on DeviantArt, doing alternative book covers and stuff. So I found a couple. So I'm going to share with you my screen, or actually, let me do this. This might be easier. Is I'm going to share with you the judge. This is a rendering someone did of the judge. And it's funny because this is how I imagine the judge to look. I mean, I don't know why, but I see him like this. So I think it's almost like if we were going to do a movie, I really think Woody Harrelson would be a perfect judge. So,
Exactly. It's from Wag the Dog, right?
or even Natural Born Killers.
Yeah.
Right? That would be a very good Woody Allen. Now, there's the judge, which I love. Here's a really crazy book cover that I also love. And this I found on DeviantArt. So can you see the whole thing?
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, it's crazy. So it's got the judge above the Native American, who's above the captain, and they're all scalping each other. And it's just a wild, and it's got the kind of snakes and hawks and
Yeah.
everything in the background. It's an insane vision. So another one I found, which I love. And this one for me is possibly the most poetic. This is another book cover. And this is someone who did this on DeviantArt again. And I found a whole series of them on DeviantArt, and they're really beautiful. And this is the one that I think captures in some ways that sense of the color and the environment and these players on that environment, right? Like this kind of canvas in which they exist. And you have the meridian, and I just love it. I mean, I love the idea that these deep oranges and these deep reds and this notion of the horror of the landscape itself playing a crucial role. I mean, the landscape itself again and again becomes very violent, right? Like they can't find water, they can't feed themselves, right? They're basically, they're a victim of, or they're at least prey to the landscape around them. And this last one is Glanton. This is awesome. So that's Glanton on top of basically a
Yeah.
pile of scalped whoever's. It could be anyone with Glanton, right? But it's just a really series of very dark visuals. But the book is very visual, right? The book does call out the visuals for you. And the way in which I was reading to close attention, like, for example, one particular scene that struck me is, so the kid is captured and he's being brought to prison. And along the way, he's brought to this little town before he goes to Chihuahua. And it's in that town that he goes and he sees the asps. And he's going, and basically there's like street vendors or just a market that he's walking along on the street. And he sees asps and lizards and all of these kind of beautifully described kind of horrors. And then there's someone with leprosy who's selling, I forget what he's selling. He's selling something disturbing, like some sort of medicine, but there's that. And then he comes and he sees a jar with Captain White's head in it, preserved, and the hair floating, right? It's almost like out of Creep Show, right? When the two are like underneath the water and you see the hair floating. Like, and I was like, this is such a visual entity right now. And sometimes it's completely biblical and like there's very minimal, but sometimes description is completely poetic and graphic. And it brings you in that you can feel like you could totally film this. It's interesting. I mean, the book goes. The book itself is not consistent, right? It goes from the biblical parable to the highly graphic, to the completely ambiguous and just suggested. Like, it has no one absolute tone it's working in when it's describing the environment within which you find yourself.
Yeah, it's looking at it from all the different angles, kind of.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people who have crazy readings of the book. And they take those three epigraphs, right? I think the first being the first is the three epigraphs, right? The one I talked about was the scalping 300,000 years old from a clipping in 1982. The second is like a Gnostic philosopher who's talking about there's no dark and shadow. It's just swallowed up into the all one thing. Like,
it is not to be thought that the life of darkness is sunk in misery and lost as it's in sorrowing. There is no sorrowing, for sorrow is a thing that is swallowed up in death, and death and dying are the very life of the darkness.
Yeah, like that idea, like we were talking about a little bit earlier, like there is no separation, right? It's all of a piece. And like, I don't know enough about Gnostic philosophy to speak at all intelligently about it. But, there's this sense that like, evil is everywhere. Evil isn't just this thing abided to Satan, in hell somewhere, right? Evil is everyone and everything. And it engulfs us, but it's also a part of us. It's like, it's something you have to come to some sort of terms with, which I do think is what McCarthy's seems to be, at least his journey is coming to terms with that. Like, but what was the first quote?
Sin, yeah.
Was the first quote from Paul Valery?
Yeah.
Which I love. I think it's my favorite.
Your ideas are terrifying and your hearts are faint. Your acts of pity and cruelty are absurd, committed with no calm, as if they were irresistible. Finally, you fear blood more and more, blood and time.
Yeah. And I love this because I find it true in my own life. Like, as time goes on, right? I fear blood and time more and more. And these ideas in this book, I think, become more and more terrifying. The more and more you have to deal with the mortality of it all, and the darkness that's going to swallow us. Like, how do we come to terms with that? Like, in this book, we're everywhere surrounded by it. And I just love this idea of, these faint hearts that are terrified of this reality that this book is about to bring you through. And it's nice because you start off with Valerie saying, you weak asses, you can't deal with this book. the Gnostic saying it's all the same, there's no right or wrong. And then the 1982 Texas newspaper saying, shit, man, scalping? We've been scalping each other for hundreds of thousands of years. Like, this is timeless. And that's from 82. And I just, like, these trilogy of horror.
Yeah.
Before you even get into the first line of the book.
Yeah. And like he says, in the end, he shall never die. You know?
Yeah, it's true, man. Something's going on with time. And it's funny because I'm only halfway through it on the second read. And like I said, I'm loving it even more the second time. But like I'm finding myself, I'm reading passages 3 and 4 times. Because I'll get lulled into the language and the movement of the language. What the hell happened? Like, I can't, because we talk a little bit about the style, I can't make sense like of the way in which sentences ride into each other. There's no punctuation, there's no contraction, there's no quotes. Like, there's no sense of anything being distinguished, right? It's like that idea of the sand dunes or the waves I talked about earlier. Like, it all kind of flows into each other and, you know, kind of lulled into it, but also like that sense of time that the book itself unfolds, right? And the way in which it blurs into each other and it's not clear. And I feel like something I just read, I have no recollection of, and that might be also my age, but I actually have to think it has something to do with the style. Who's saying who to what? You know,
Yeah.
that kind of sense of like not at all being pinned in any kind of binary, like who's talking to who. Like, it's just the style itself is insane.
Yeah, I mean, there's, like I said, that ambiguity, and it's got to come through more in print than it did in the audiobook because the guy has to put interpretation on it. With his vocal characterization, he's defining who's saying what, whereas you could probably read it in different ways. And there's whole long passages where he refers to like he did this and he did that, and I'm trying to remember like who he is, you know.
Exactly. And the thing you point out is good. The notion of the interpretation that obviously lays on top of a reading like an audiobook. But the thing is when I listen to the guy read the audiobook, I'm like, wow, it sounds so book-like. Whereas when you're reading it in my head, it seems almost like thoughts. Like, it doesn't seem like people are talking. It doesn't seem like any of this is happening. It seems like a dream, which is so weird, right? It's so different. It's like it's the Kafka-like dream versus what, you know, obviously you're interpreting it and you're enunciating it and you're putting it out there, it becomes a narrative. But when I'm reading it to myself, it's still in this dreamlike state.
Yeah. So here's a quote about a dream.
There was a groan from the far side of the room. A man rose and went along the wall and bent to speak with others. The groans came again, and the old man passed his hand before his face twice and kissed the ends of his fingers and looked up. "How much monies they pay you?" he said. No one spoke. "You kill Gomez. They pay you much monies." The man in the dark of the far wall moaned again. "Madre de Dios," he called. "Gomez, Gomez," said the old man. "Even Gomez. Who can ride against the Tejanos? They are soldiers. Que soldados tan valientes. La sangre de Gomez. Sangre de la gente." He looked up. "Blood," he said. "These countries give much blood. This Mexico. This is a thirsty country. The blood of 1,000 Christs. Nothing." He made a gesture toward the world beyond, where all the land lay under darkness, and all a great stained altar stone. He turned and poured his wine, and poured again from the water jar, temperate old man, and drank. The kid watched him. He watched him drink, and he watched him wipe his mouth. When he turned, he spoke neither to the kid nor Toadvine, but seemed to address the room. "I pray to God for this country. I say that to you. I pray. I don't go in the church. What I need to talk to them dolls there. I talk here." He pointed to his chest. When he turned to the Americans, his voice softened again. "You are fine caballeros," he said. "You kill the barbaros. They cannot hide from you. But there is another caballero, and I think that no man hides from him. I was a soldier. It is like a dream. When even the bones is gone in the desert, the dreams is talk to you. You don't wake up forever.
There's
Yeah.
another quote where there's just like so many things in there.
I mean, exactly. And that character, it's like also for me, as he's coming up to them in the bar, and we learn that his son has been cut, right, and is bleeding, and they're like, why didn't he do something? He's like, what am I going to do, right? Like, what choice do I have? But like, there's that moment where there's this great tension between this guy and him facing off, because my inclination whenever I'm reading any confrontation in this book is that someone's going to die. Like, the fact that someone walks away from it, like the clown family, the fact that they weren't savagely brutalized, the fact that this guy was not, killed in this confrontation is almost like a relief. And he's talking about these things, but like, it's hard for me to sometimes focus on the philosophy because I'm just worried about what's going to happen. Like, there's this real sense of anxiety as I'm working my way through this book.
He talks about, blood, and his country has given so much blood, and the blood of 1,000 Christs, and that like makes me think of the biblical aspect as well, the idea of like the cleansing power of blood. I don't know what to read into that, because there's no salvation here,
And I mean, you think a little bit about, there's a lot of ways you can go with it. One of the things that struck me on this reading was a couple of moments where you had that vampire bat. Was it Sproul on top of Sproul getting ready to suck the blood from him, or sucking the blood from him, and he was on his deathbed anyway, as we learned, as he's sleeping? It's a really disturbing scene. You have this bat on this man, sucking the blood out of him as he's slowly dying anyway, and waking up and completely like, what the hell, from a bad dream. And you have this other scene, which struck me on this time, is you have the Glanton group walking, right, single file, not walking, riding single file to wherever they're going. And they have a couple of elks that they had killed. And behind them, running single file, you have a group of wolves. And there's this whole idea like, don't kill a wolf, but also like Glanton looking back at his group, you have the lead wolf identically looking back to his group. And this relationship that came up in one of the quotes earlier that we heard between, humanity and the wolf, although humanity just taking that notion of ferociousness and viciousness to the next level, right? And forever, is that the way in which, again, it's almost like Terrence Malick with some of his ways in which nature speaks to the philosophy of the world in which we inhabit. And I really feel like Cormac McCarthy takes a page out of Terrence Malick's book, or vice versa, although Malick had been doing this for a while, so maybe they're two on par. But like, there's this notion of nature speaking to the philosophy that you hear at points, in this case from the judge or from other figures. And the nature for me on this time around speaks even more loudly than the kind of Nietzschean nihilistic kind of pulpit-driven sermons by any of these characters. I mean, the nature itself speaks volumes of what they're trying to say. It's crazy.
Yeah. All right, so my time's coming to an end here, so we need to wrap this up.
So who's going to have the unlucky job of summing up Blood Meridian? Because I do not want to. I don't think I can, right?
Yeah, I don't know if we could
But
sum it up.
I think that's why it's been the best book I've read. I mean, I think I've been reading, I read a lot anyway, but I have been reading probably than I did when I was an undergrad and around that time, even grad school. But this is, when I picked this book up 5 years ago, I was sure, as I was 50 pages into it, that this had been the best book I had read in the last 10 or 15 years. And it's quickly becoming one of my favorite books of all time. I am really, and I don't know if it's the violence. Like, I mean, my wife jokes about me. She's like, the violence, like, what's with you and the violence? Like the Mario Bava, you know, Cormac McCarthy, like what, you know, you should see a shrink. I understand, like, that's possibly true. The other side to me, though, is just how lyrical this relationship of violence is and how it kind of folds back into a world and a narrative that is truly compelling. Like, what happens in the Blood Meridian? Like, it's an interesting question, like, plot-wise, what happens? And it's very picaresque, like, even down to the chapters where they have, like, they tell you exactly what's going to happen, almost like, you know, you would have in Cervantes or in some of those older kind of picaresque novels. You have that, and it's a series of episodes that end kind of in a culmination of, you know, war and death and peace, but at the same time, it's narratively inconsequential in some ways. Like, what happens? Like, it's all about the description and the vision that you get along the way, right? Like,
it's all in the language, you know. It's
exactly
at once like minimalist in a way, and other times archaic and expansive and baroque, and I don't know. I mean, it's just the power of the words that he uses and the way he uses them.
Really, just he's in this book, and they say it's his magnum opus and whatever. Like, he just really does something with language that's akin to masters like his contemporary Toni Morrison with Beloved, or Faulkner. Like, it's of that rank, or even Kafka in my mind. His way to kind of imagine a dream. Like, so many of the best writers of the 20th century. And it's hard to read it at times because there's no holding back with the language, with the racism, with the violence. Like, you know, it's in your face. And if you were to teach a book like this, you know, you would have to navigate a lot of, I mean, if there's a woman in it, I don't know who she is. Like, if there's a figure in it, like, that's redeemable, I don't know who that would be. So it's an interesting book. I mean, in that way, it's like nothing else I've ever read.
Yeah. It sort of puts the final nail into the Western in a way. Mm-hmm.
It kind of does. Like, you know, 10 years later, you have Westerns like Dead Man and Unforgiven. And I think Dead Man's an interesting take on the genre, right? Yeah. I think in some ways, Alex Cox around the same time is doing stuff like Walker, right? Which kind of has that imperialistic bent to it, which really, I think, lines up with some of this. But none of those visions can come close to the kind of, like you're saying, and you've said throughout this discussion, this epic, timeless, biblical-like sense of the West as, you know, the frontier for this violent conflagration of humanity. Like, it is biblical in its proportions, truly, you know, and it seems to read like that. And no Western I've ever seen, maybe save The Searchers, even comes close.
Yeah. And then,
I mean, the Bunch, maybe, because it's my favorite.
I don't know if it means anything, but it's set, you know, the time setting is actually before, I think, your traditional Western. Like, they tend to be late Civil War, you know, like second half of the 19th century, where this is pre-Civil War. Like,
that's interesting.
The darkness and the ugliness was always there, I guess. Again, that timelessness. Yeah.
Or even like everything that came after this moment was The Pretenders. Like, you know what I mean? Like this was like these Texas Rangers. Like, some of the things I wrote about this separate thing was Joaquin Murrieta and the gold rush in Northern California, and just the kind of deep races against that. Well, that's around this era too. and the annexation of a huge swath of North America during the Mexican-American War. Like all of these things, like I think the West, speaking to what you're talking about, is kind of a product of the mythos of the West as a product of one of the most imperialistic moments in American history, rather than this kind of free-flowing, oh, we're going to go there and see what's happening on the West and maybe settle and maybe start a new civilization and cycle. No, that civilization was started decades earlier and written completely in blood. And that's an interesting take on that story, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, again, the way it's written, there's so many ways to take it and so many things you can pull out of. Even with those little passages, you could like pick apart sentences and phrases and do a paragraph on each one, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I agree. Paul, this was fun.
Yeah.
What's our next book? We got to do another one. I was actually thinking, as we were talking, as I was reading this, I've never read Larry McMurtry's Lonesome Dove, which I heard is, if there's another Western of similar epic proportions, it might be that one.
I've never read it either. I don't even know what
It's
it's
long
about.
as shit. It's like the Bleak House of of Western novels. But it'd be interesting.
Maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll think about it.
Okay. Well, I'm going to call this quits. Signing off.